So, Rachel, we put together a definition of the Chief of Staff. 9 functions, one whole system, not a checklist that you pick and choose from. It is a system. And we touched on some of these last week, but it starts with the intelligence foundation, the positional and the political intelligence. So, positional. What does that mean?
Well, Susie, since I have it right in front of me on my computer, look, the positional sort of approach here is that there's no other particular vantage point. This is your Switzerland. You oversee the entire organization, and your view of the organization is unique in that everybody else has a P&L. You are the only C-suite executive who does not. And the whole point is so that you can serve as essentially Switzerland, and provide the kind of positional perspective that an executive desperately needs when they're surrounded by sometimes sycophants, right? Or yes men, people who sit there and just say, you're great, you're fabulous, everything's wonderful, when in fact, that's not the reality at all. You're the truth teller. It's rooted in truth because you understand everything about the organization broadly. And so that, I think, makes a really big difference. And as an aside, you and I were having a conversation with somebody the other day where I said, there's one person I cannot chief of staff, and it is my son, who is just turned 4. And it occurred to me this morning that the reason why is because I have no positional sort of perspective on him, right? In that I'm not neutral.
You are too emotionally involved.
I'm too emotionally involved to really chief of staff him. And so, yeah, I think that this is an enormously important part of the role, is that you don't own anything. You own everything. And so you're responsible for all risk mitigation. It's not just in this particular space or over here. You're looking at the broader organization.
It's interesting because someone said to me recently, I've heard this quite a lot on, but which line in the P&L are you responsible for? Where do we see the benefit? And I said, you should be responsible for the same criteria, the same metrics that the person you're working with is. And if that is a CEO, they're responsible for the whole P&L. And that is the responsibility. Right. It is for everything. It's not just one line, one little bit. You are looking after the whole organization. And that's why the positional aspect is so foundational to the chief of staff role. But then we come to the next part of the foundation, which is the political intelligence. And everyone always makes the mistake, not everyone, that's me being too broad there, of when you say political, of thinking that it's politics with the capital P, that you're being nefarious or Machiavellian and you're trying to maneuver things. But it's about the understanding of how the power actually works and influence works throughout the organization. Who are the people that have that ability to turn a dial without the authority to do it, the relationships that go through. It's not how the org chart works, it's how the actual organization works and understanding that. And yeah, it's the tensions and the alliances, knowing that if you have Fred who's just digging their heels in and won't move on something, that you can go and ask Bob, who's not in the same department, not their manager or anything, to go have a quiet word. Can you speak to them? Knowing that they will have that influence to be able to do that.
This is where it becomes important that this is a senior leadership position, because You need the experience and sort of the life experience to be able to say, I know what the org chart says. Now I'm actually going to figure out what exists in reality, and that those are often very different. I always make a point, and perhaps this is because I was an executive assistant at the very, very beginning of my career. My first job out of college was an EA. And, the people who were nice to me got in to see my executive. And the people who were not so nice to me, it was a lot harder to get to see them. And I think that, it's always these sort of lower level people, not always, I mean, it's not exclusive, but it's often people who are underestimated, overlooked. These are the people who have extraordinary influence, and they know everything about what's going on in reality, as opposed to what the org chart says. And the distinctions around that become critically important for a variety of reasons. But I do think it's incredibly important to recognize that, and I've made the mistake, incidentally, also of not figuring that out. And I've suffered the consequences for it, right? Which is the opposite problem. But I've been in a situation where I trusted certain people and they were the wrong people. And I didn't figure it out until it was over and it was too late. And I think that experience really motivated me to be a better listener, a more active listener when I'm working in an environment where I'm unclear what the roles and responsibilities are in reality. You can have them on an org chart, you can list them out, it's great, but it's not enough. And so this becomes enormously important.
That's really interesting, because what was coming to my mind then is that making that mistake is such a great way of learning. And that comes back to the experience part of most of people, once they've had that level of experience, they've made those mistakes. They've hopefully learned from them, and they can see the patterns happening again. They can see the breakdowns in the relationships. They can see the relationships that are working. And without making those mistakes, I honestly don't believe that people grow and get better at things, because if you're never making any mistakes at anything, how are you learning?
Right. And I think the other thing that I often think about when I'm thinking about this particular function is, say what you will about the Clintons. You can love them, you can hate them. But when Hillary Clinton was elected to the Senate, it was a legendary moment, because she actually did nothing for the first couple of weeks except invite people to her office or go to other people's offices and listen. It was the famous listening tour across the entire US Senate. And if you go back and read, particularly Republican senators who really hated her husband and her, the two of them were really hated and reviled. But she won their respect because she understood that she needed to listen before anything else. And in absorbing all of this information and in demonstrating some level of humility, she won people over and really was seen as an equal, a fair partner, somebody who could collaborate across party lines. And she really won the respect of a lot of people in the US Senate, which is not an easy group to win over.
I can imagine. And there is a lot of pressure to deliver and show your worth within the first 90 days in roles now. And yet
Oh,
that
Suzi, don't get
listening
me started on the
aspect.
90-day thing, because you know how much I hate this. You can't.
I was waiting for that.
You just, you
It's like
cannot
pressing a
evaluate.
button. It's
I mean, you can talk,
oh,
like, look, if you want to evaluate a data scientist in 90 days, knock yourself out. But if you want to really understand how a chief of staff operates and really gets to sort of the heart of how they operate, whether they're going to be successful, if you're looking at that in 90 days, you are delusional, because there's no way that you can build the kind of relationships and foster the kind of sort of really important networking and political maneuvering. And to some degree, I don't think it's Machiavellian, but it's something. The chief of staff comes in there and needs to make assessments and understand what's going on, and nothing is written down. And it's a very complex, complicated job. And if you're evaluating people on 3 months, you're bananas. I can't help you because I don't know how to help you, because you're nuts. And I know that this is very popular, and I'm going to write about this in our newsletter. In my next it's a 90-day myth, and it is complete baloney wrapped in horse manure. I don't believe that you can really evaluate a chief of staff in 90 days. It just can't be done.
No, I agree. I completely agree, because that relationship
I
building.
love it when we agree.
I know I talk of. Well, it happens sometimes, but that relationship building, and I know I talk a lot about trust. Trust takes time. And to be a chief of staff in an organization, you need to have the trust of not just the person you're working with, but across the whole of the leadership team and across the whole of the organization. And you can't do that in 90 days, unless it's a very, very small organization where you can spend huge amounts of time doing that and not much else. It takes time, because the trust comes from when they see you actually doing what you say you're going to do. And 90 days, sorry, it's just bonkers.
I want to make one point, which is that doesn't mean the chiefs of staff cannot come in and make an impact and a difference, and a formidable one, within the first 2 weeks, right? There are things that can happen.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I once had a founder say something to me like, if you can't get stuff done in 90 days, then I don't need you. And, of course, we're capable of changing dynamics and processes and doing sort of surface level work that can make a difference. But the reality is, if you want to really get the full benefit of the chief of staff position and leverage it properly, you're not evaluating it in 90 days. There's just no way.
I think that comes back to, if we look at the definition we have of the chief of staff, it covers the underlying mechanics of the role rather than the tasks. You can start making an impact on those tasks almost from day one. But the real value, the value that you get after those 90 days comes from this scaffolding, but that is below the role, because those tasks will change as the organization changes, as the challenges change, and grows or contracts, whatever's happening. Yeah, I'm not going to go off on a rant on that one at the moment, because we have got still 7 more aspects and layers of the definition to go through. Otherwise, we'll still be trying to get through to the end of the definition by the time it comes to Christmas. And yeah, well, we could be. Who knows? So we've got the intelligence foundation, which sets up everything. And then the next part, which again starts from day one, but doesn't really kick in until much, much later, is the intelligence layer of the diagnostic, of the pattern recognition across the whole system. And most organizations are complex. They're not simple little diagrams that live in the org chart and you just go through your process and tasks. There's so many different aspects in the organization. And this is where the value of the chief of staff really comes in, of being able to see the whole system, of being able to see the patterns across different areas.
I think pattern recognition can come in a wide variety of forms, but I think one of the most important is to understand how people approach the world, how they make decisions, and recognizing that there is a pattern of behavior that happens with people who are accustomed to a particular view of the world and accustomed to a way in which they're making decisions. And so, my best sort of example of this was when I was working somewhere, and it became quite clear that the sort of overarching executive, the CEO equivalent, wasn't going to call the shots. He or she expected every sort of manager of divisions, right, to sort of make the decisions around what we were going to do first, what we were going to do, what were the priorities, all these things. And, sometimes you walk into an office or a building and an institution and you say, okay, the executive is quite clear. The CEO knows what they want. They know how they want to do it. And your job is to execute. But this one was very interested in delegating. And the problem was, if you had somebody at the top of a division who was looking for, leadership at the very, very top, you weren't going to find it. You needed to take a stand. And there were some people who did very well in that set of circumstances. And there are other people who just don't. They don't have the creativity or the perspective or whatever it is, the magic sauce. But the patterns around the way in which people behave become very important. And that also sort of dictates the chief of staff role, certainly, I think.
I just thought of an example that I could share.
Oh, great.
I know. I feel so pleased with myself.
You should.
So there was an organization where there would be the leadership meetings and everyone would say, yep, we fully understand, everyone's aligned. And yet nothing seemed to move. Nothing was moving. And the pattern that was happening there wasn't actually I hate the term, but I love the psychological safety within the room for anyone to be able to say, I don't understand, or I'm not sure that we are aligned. So everyone was just nodding along and saying, yes, 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 we know what we're doing, coming out and not knowing what they're doing, still not knowing what the decision was. There were not decisions being made in those meetings. So on paper and the words that were said, yes, we know what we're doing, we know what we've decided. But when you actually looked at it, there wasn't a clear decision. There wasn't any decision making happening. There wasn't the conversation that was flagging all of the issues of, actually, even if we'd made that decision, we still can't do it because of. And no one was talking to each other because they all thought it was just them. And that's where, again, that's the relational diagnostic and pattern recognition aspect of it. And again, why the chief of staff being able to be Switzerland and speak to all of them without them feeling that they're going to be detrimentally penalized by their boss for saying, I don't know, is really key. The next part, when we're looking at the whole role, is actually the way in which the chief of staff is looking. It's a bit like Janus, looking in two directions, looking at the executive, but also looking at the organization. And it's that dual aspect. And there's some key parts in there. And the first, I mean, again, I hear like, you're there to enact the CEO's vision. But what if the CEO is wrong?
Well, that's right. Because they can be, right? Um,
Anyone can be wrong.
well, that's right. Yeah, this is sort of my favorite part of the chief of staff role. Mostly because this one and the truth telling. So it's like two things that go together hand in hand, which is directional and truth telling. Um, and I think this is also what makes the role so challenging and uniquely hard. Um, because ultimately, you are speaking truth to power. That's what this comes down to. Um, and I don't really want to go into the gender differences here, but I do think that women who speak truth to power are often in a position where their jobs are at stake. I've read this fabulous book that I'm going to plug here because I think it's just that good, and I think that every chief of staff should read it, which is a book called Walking on Broken Glass. And it's written by Julia Carrion and Shannon Nutter. It's going out, it's being released in September. I was a beta reader for it. But what's so interesting is that it sort of describes this history of women getting pushed out of jobs and why it happens and how it happens. And it turns out that there's a type that really traditionally gets pushed out, and it's generally a chief of staff. You know, they spoke with a whole slew of people, and chiefs of staff were very traditionally, evaluated as they've got to go because you are not doing your job in this role if you are not challenging people and saying, can we just think about that one more time?
So many examples coming to my mind on this one. I remember being sat in a brand discussion, and I was not that I was there in a not in a participatory role. So I was sat there listening, and the brand that they were all coalescing around, when said out loud, said the word pathetic. And so I'm sat there going, am I the only person that can see this? Why is no one speaking up? There are people in this room who know better. And in the end, I couldn't. I mean, you know me well enough. I couldn't keep my mouth shut. And I did say something. And you could see that moment of, oh, yeah, okay. And it was vetoed straight away. But if I had kept quiet, that is the decision that would have been made in the room because people won't speak up. And again, on these ones, I can't give an example, but actually there was one. There was something that was happening, and the person I was working with, the whole team was there, and they go, no, there's not enough time to do this. We can't do it in the time that's been allowed. And everyone, again, was just about to agree and pack everything up and postpone it. And I said, no, let's try it. I think we can do it in the time. We had 45 minutes to get through what we needed to get through. 43 minutes later, we had done it. And again, it's not so much always saying something's wrong, but it's having that confidence and courage to say, let's just do it. Let's stop putting the brakes on at times and speaking against the flow, because I can tell you every other person in that room would have gone, yes, okay, we'll put it in for another time and do it later. 43 minutes instead of 45, and it was done and off the table. And if you can't do that, and it comes from both sides, if you can't do that as a person, possibly the chief of staff role is not right for you. I will say it out loud. You need to be able to do it. have those hard conversations, and have those hard conversations with the person that your role relies on. But on the other side of it, and again, it's going to come back to the trust, the person, the people, not just the person, but the people you are having those conversations with, because those hard conversations go across the organization at times, need to be able to trust you, that you are saying it, you are having that conversation from the right place. And that's really, really important. And that's why, again, this is a system, not a tick box exercise, because without the aspect of being able to have the political intelligence and the diagnostic and making those relationships, you're not able to have those hard conversations that allow you to move everything forward. That's looking at the executive side, but you've then got the organizational side, which still leverages a lot of those previous ones on the political foundations.
I think the one other point that I want to make is that, you know, when I watched John Podesta do this job with Bill Clinton, I think I mentioned this in the last episode, which is like, you know, it's very easy for presidents to be surrounded by people who think they're amazing, and who just completely hook, line, and sinker. And I think John was particularly gifted at telling President Clinton no without undermining the president's authority or right. I mean, it's a dance. It's a dance, and you have to learn how to do it. But somebody needs to be in the room to say, you cannot do that. And it's really up to the chief of staff to do it. I think, yeah, because, and again, what goes back to the positional, which is you don't own anything. So you have a lot less to lose when you confront your executive and say, you can't do that. You know, it becomes a very different conversation if you own, you know, any part of the organization exclusively. You're advocating in a way that's skewed. So, yeah, but we should move on to the sort of the others.
The brokerage and the sounding board come into it when you're looking at the whole of the organization side. But I was just actually thinking there about that skill in communication. And again, I remember another example. I wasn't actually in a chief of staff role, and I had a meeting with a secretary of state, and their team was in there. And basically, I had to tell them that they weren't prioritizing some of their time in the right areas, and that they needed to be doing things differently. I was basically being told to tell them to pull their finger out in a certain direction. And I came out of the meeting. I can't even remember the words I used in it. I mean, this is many years ago now. And I walked out of the meeting with one of the parliamentary assistants from his team. And they turned around to me and said, I have never heard him, I will say it's a him, be so resoundly told off in a way that sounded so nice and that they actually listened to.
Yeah.
So it comes to that understanding people, understanding the relationships, understanding that some people you will need to be able to, some people you can turn around and say, you're being an idiot. What on earth are you thinking about? I mean, it's ridiculous. And if I'm involved in that, there'd probably be quite a lot of swear words in there. And other times with the people that you're talking to and trying to, again, bring things together, bring the minds together, which comes to the brokerage, you're going to have to use a little bit more sugar. You're going to have to understand what motivates them, what actually will get them to move in the direction that they need to do. So, and that's why the brokerage across the organization. It's not setting up meetings. It's not always just putting two people together. It's bringing their minds and their views together so that everyone then starts moving in the direction that it needs to.
Yeah, I think that this is, another hugely important one. And it's also among my favorite, in part because what I think is so easy and simple is actually the equivalent to nuclear physics for other people. For example, every meeting should have an agenda. And yet you'd think that I was, deconstructing Fermat's enigma, his famous theorem that some Princeton professor solved like several years ago. But I mean, just the most difficult math equation you could ever imagine is the equivalent to having an agenda. It's just like impossible for some people to figure out what they're going to say and talk about.
I, I
And
I'm
I
gonna
think,
I'm gonna admit I'm absolutely guilty of that. Of and this is why it's not an admin role. I mean, because I'm just sat here thinking, and this is why the executive assistant is so key to ensure that those meetings have got agendas. Because if it was left down to me, there wouldn't be agendas because it's just so not up on my priority list. Sorry, Rachel.
but I got to tell
I
you,
agree. They
I
do
mean,
need an agenda.
they, and I talked about this in a previous newsletter edition, which is meeting hygiene. There's like some basics. You need an agenda. You need to make sure the right people are in the room, and you need to make sure that the people who don't need to be in the room are not in the room because it just adds to the chaos. And I have to say that I loved building our meeting tool because it helps people identify whether it's actually a meeting or it's an email or it's like a conversation offline. And chiefs of staff need to be good about this because, and frankly, it's only going to get worse. There's so many inputs in an executive's day-to-day activities. I mean, they're just completely overwhelming. And as they become more and more ubiquitous and they're all over the place, you've got to be really razor focused. And you can't have a million meetings. It just doesn't work. People need time to think and breathe and let things sort of marinate in their heads. And there's no opportunity to do that if you're booked back to back to back. And so, yeah, I think that this is a
Oh,
huge part of the relationship between the executive admin and the chief of staff, which is the chief of staff needs to say, look, this is a really important meeting, but this one isn't. But the admin is the one that has to figure out the Tetris of the calendar and making sure that an executive's time is protected and all of the things that are needed in order to be a fully functional executive. So in my mind, the brokerage thing is really important, and it's important. And that's why it's also really important to not get evaluated on a 90-day schedule, because you need to meet with people consistently. It's not something where you meet with them once, you figured it out, that's it, it's done. Things are evolving, things are moving. And so you have to meet with people on a pretty frequent basis in order to determine who needs to be in what room for what discussion. And does it need to be a meeting? Often no. But, I also think that the worst meetings are the ones where the person who needs to be in the meeting is not in the meeting. And then you've just spent 45 minutes talking about something and you've got, a constituent who is absolutely critical and essential, and you've wasted everybody's time because they're not there. So I feel like, my mother who taught Shakespeare, we had a favorite sonnet, the two of us, and it's like, with what I most enjoy, contented least. And I think agendas for me are really important. And a to-do list at the end of it, right? There has to be some sort
Oh,
of
I'm
conclusion
not.
of,
I'm totally in agreement with you. What I'm just sat here laughing to myself at is I am so not the person to be putting the agenda together or the to-do list.
well,
That's
that's
what
why
I'm
we created the
laughing at.
tool, right? Is that the tool, you can just throw in a bunch of notes, and the tool on our website will actually help you generate an agenda that makes
It's,
sense and
I
that
have to say,
asks the right
it's
questions.
absolutely brilliant. And thank you for building that because it is absolutely brilliant. And anyone who hasn't had
I'm
a
quite
chance
proud
to
of it.
try it out, I would really suggest you do. Um, it was genius. It's absolutely genius. But then that brings us back to the last part on that directional looking outwards of the sounding board. And some people mistake this for being the person who's sort of making decisions or shaping decisions behind the scenes of what goes. And it's not that. It's about, again, I'm going to say it again, trust that people are able to bring half formed or nearly fully formed ideas and projects to you so that you are able to help them sharpen those, that when they get to the decision making stage they are pretty much there so that those decisions can be made well. And it's not about going, yes, that's a good thing, or doing this. It's about asking those questions, giving the gentle, or sometimes depending who it is, firm pushbacks of, have you considered this? And so it's not taking their decision away from them, it's enabling them to put those ideas and projects in a better shape for when they go public. And if people can't
Right.
come and speak to you and go, oh, I've had this really good idea, I think we should build a meeting tool that's going to help everyone. You can go, but what have you considered this? Why is it going to help everyone? So it sharpens their thinking and the work behind it because they will get those questions when it goes to the decision making.
And I will say too that I think what becomes critical here is some of the earlier stuff we were talking about, which is you have to be Switzerland. You cannot come with a particular point of view or a particular uh, area of advocacy and think that you're going to be a neutral sounding board. You're not. And part of the beauty of this role, again, is sort of the vantage point, which is you see the whole organization. You're familiar with all of the different functions and how people are thinking about everything that they own, right? And so you bring a particular perspective that's unique because nobody has the sort of broad understanding of the organization that you do. And that's when you're able to provide this view of, have you thought about this? Would you consider it this way? Those are the things, and you have to be a neutral party in order to be an honest broker. And I just think that it's essential to recognize that, and this goes to also the stepping stone problem, which is everybody is now creating these roles as if the chief of staff is merely a stepping stone to becoming a better founder, a CEO, all those things. No, the chief of staff is meant to be the person who is aligning, coordinating, you know, and brokering and all the things that we've talked about. But this sounding board element, it's essential that you be neutral.
Yeah, absolutely. And the stepping stone thing, I do get it. I do get it. I know I can see exactly where it's come from. But it doesn't make sense to me if that you've got someone with the experience, with that seniority, with that level of why it's then assumed that it's a stepping stone into roles that I would see as a demotion. Because they go, as the organization grows, you could move into VP of of strategy. And I'm sat here
Right.
thinking, as the organization grows, the chief of staff role grows across the organization. So you're then going from this level down to over here. It doesn't make sense to me. It really doesn't. But
In our
and
last
that's
few
because
minutes,
I think because too many people, I mean, this is part of the role, but too many people over index on the next one, which is the incubation. And that's holding those special projects, those places that
I
don't
was going
have
to
a
say
home
it's
yet.
it's the chief of staff of special projects. It's my favorite.
Oh, the chief of staff, the chief of
Chief of
staff. It's like,
staff.
oh,
Ugh.
and the over indexation on this of like you're some sort of dumping ground. When in reality, what you are is you are a custodian while something is I mean, we're mothers being birthed and coming to life. And then you are going, right, where is the right place for this to live? Because it shouldn't live with me. There you go, send them off to boarding school. And
Oh
I didn't
God.
send my children to I did not send my
I
children to
could
boarding school.
never. I
Um,
could never. Okay.
but just to carry that analogy through. And because you should never become the blockage, you should never become the crucial aspect of if something is only working because you are there, you haven't actually done your job. But it is your job to then take something and put it in, build it to a stage where it can then go to its proper end home. And that's really, really important. But do think that that is over index at times, and then that you have chiefs of staff where everything's just dumped on them and they end up with just all of these different things and they become a bit of jack of all trades rather than a master of being a chief of staff.
The positioning here is important for me because I think you also need to be the person who's not just reactive all the time. And so this sort of notion of an incubation function is really about making sure that the organization is moving in the direction that it should, but having a much broader view of the future because you know what people are thinking about and considering. And so, again, it goes to your own knowledge of the organization and how the organization is moving forward. And if people start bringing you ideas that A, take up your time, and B, that ultimately are not worthwhile, you're spending a lot of time. I mean, all of these other functions that we've talked about require an enormous amount of time and energy and effort. And so if the incubation becomes your primary role, or it's the thing that keeps you most busy, you're neglecting all of this other stuff, which is actually really essential because nobody else in the organization is doing it but you. That's it. Yeah.
Yeah, being able to say no. And that actually brings it to the last aspect, which is the guardian. And it's not being a gatekeeper, it's not stopping access, but it's allowing the executive to have sort of plausible deniability at time, and you
Yep.
being able to go around and say, no, that's not happening. You can be the bad guy, keep their ledger clean for when it's needed, and take that burden almost, because it takes time to say no in ways that doesn't completely destroy teams or relationships. And being able to be the person that turns around and says, no, this isn't the right time. It's a great idea, but we need to be concentrating on these things at the moment, but
Right.
we can come back to it later. Or just saying, we haven't got time. He hasn't got time. She hasn't got time to be looking at this.
The guardian issue is essential. I mean, these are all very important, but the guardian issue, again, it's because AI and inputs, they're just overwhelming. And the CEO or an executive, whatever it is, whoever it is that you're defending. Ultimately, you know, they can't always say no. There are political implications, there are institutional implications, and, you know, CEOs are not meant to be the bad guys, but somebody needs to be around there. And in an executive office, generally the chief of staff is. Um, and you really need to be able to say to people, she's not available for that, or she can't do that. That's not a good use of time. And again, the executive admin is charged with sort of dealing with the rhythm of an executive schedule, right? And sort of how to protect their time in a very particular way that's strategic, but nevertheless important. Um, and sort of, but bounded by this four corners of the schedule. Whereas the chief of staff needs to look at time, energy, effort as where's the organization going? Where does it need to be going? And are we experiencing some drift here? Because drift happens so often. And you've got to have somebody to control for that. And it needs to be somebody, again, coming back to who can't own anything, because then you're advocating for a particular point of view. If you come at this and say, look, I'm going to, I'm going to step back and sort of provide you the analysis around why we can't do this, but we should be doing that. When you don't own anything, there's a legitimacy to that argument that you just don't have when you do own something. And so I think it's really important that you not only be able to say no to your boss and your executive, but you also need to be able to say no externally and tell people, no, you're not entitled to that. This is not an opportunity for you to just sort of naturally take advantage of a situation. You just can't do it.
So basically, that's the chief of staff role in a very, very, very large nutshell. And it's not a list of tasks. Those tasks change depending on where the organization is, the stage of growth, the challenges, the industry. But the core scaffolding of the chief of staff role is the definition that we've just spent far too long, an hour, which actually I think we could have spent much longer talking about.
I think that we've done a reasonably good job of sort of talking about what the chief of staff is, what the North Star is. I think, look, there are realities in any organization that you have to sort of account for. But I think here we've identified what makes it a chief of staff job, perspective and understanding of the organization. You have the proximity and relationship to the executive to be able to challenge, to be able to build trust across the organization, and essentially to serve as a guardian, as to serve as somebody who can really defend and protect. And so I think what I find frustrating about job descriptions is that a lot of these don't exist ever at all. Or they, maybe one or two things exist, but the job description doesn't reflect anywhere close to these 9 functions. And then you're not a chief of staff. I mean, that's, I think, the grand conclusion that you and I have come to. And I just so happen to think that we're right. So thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. And we'll see you next week for more of the Coul and Gold Group.